It's a huge pleasure to welcome Professor Nathalie Seddon here this afternoon. Many of you will know Nat. She is tutorial fellow here in biology, but also professor of biodiversity in the Department of Zoology in the university. She's the NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellow and also the senior fellow at the Oxford Martin School. But perhaps most importantly and relevantly, she's an advisor to COP26, an advisor to the UK government on climate change. We're really proud of that. And probably worth saying too that that is largely thanks to the generosity of alumni, particularly the Waterloo Foundation, that has been possible. I can't think of anything, any research that is more important than climate change research at the moment, for the very obvious reason that without it, if we don't get this right in the next 30 years, no other research will be possible, frankly. So it is incredibly important, and we're really proud of the role that Nat has played at COP26. And in that spirit of thanks, I want to thank everybody on the screen and those who are watching online later for all the support that alumni have given to the college over the last term, but also the last 18 months. It has made a huge difference to everybody here and has really helped the community get through it. So with that preamble, let me hand over to Nat and introduce her. Nathalie, welcome and thank you for joining us. And I know on top of COP26, you've got admissions next week, and like all the tutorial fellows here, you've got 2 weeks of interviewing. So really appreciate you taking time here. And I wanted to open the conversation, and we're going to hand over to all of you on the screen after a few minutes, but to open the conversation by asking you not about the substance, but first of all, what was COP26 like, as an experience? We saw it from the outside as a bit of a media circus, but what was it like to be there? And, did you come away impressed and heartened or not?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an absolute privilege to be here this evening. Thank you for the introduction and the kind words. It was an extraordinarily intense 2 weeks. There was a great sense of urgency, of energy, of determination, of industry. I felt that it was largely constructive and good-tempered. It was the biggest Conference of the Parties UN meeting there has ever been. So there were well over 40,000 delegates in a vast conference centre up in Glasgow. There were hundreds and hundreds of events and dozens of negotiator meetings all happening concurrently. There were people from all the world's nations and people from a very wide diversity of Indigenous communities, representation from right the way across the public and the private sector and from the research community. Extraordinarily diverse group. And clearly there was not enough representation of the most vulnerable people, and that was an issue, but there were many people from many vulnerable countries present. Personally, I found it an extraordinary privilege to be there, to be part of things, to be amongst so many who had lost so much sleep and who've basically been working 24/7 for weeks, if not months or years, to try and make COP a success, to share their work, to find solutions, all of us working frantically, literally running around. People ditched their smart shoes for trainers after one day of being there when they realized that they were going to be covering miles and miles every day, just walking to all the different meetings they were involved in. All of us working with this, as I say, common sense of purpose. It was also very moving and very distressing. We had many people there, many communities there who are facing an imminent existential threat from climate change. I'm talking about communities from the South Pacific, communities from island states all over the world, and coastal communities in the global South, for whom warming above 1.5 degrees means the loss of their country, the loss of their lands. So very, very sort of emotional as well. So a mix of feelings, but of course everything so much more extraordinary because we were in the middle of a pandemic with a lot of complex geopolitics going on. And there were a lot of issues, of course, a lot of challenges, but for me at least, it felt like a positive reset of governmental or intergovernmental efforts to address climate change. The last two COPs didn't really achieve a great deal. And then obviously the whole process was put on ice because of the pandemic. Many of us thought that maybe it wouldn't happen at all and would be postponed again. So the fact that it happened was sort of amazing. And though there are massive concerns and frustrations, especially from the most vulnerable parts of the world, and anger actually from those communities, and quite rightly so, and we can perhaps return to the substance of those concerns later, the fact that nearly 200 nations were able to agree on anything or anything resembling a decision text sort of feels sort of extraordinary at the present times to me. So sort of expectations for COP26 were really, really high. And some of these were met, some of them were exceeded, and some of them really were not, and I think it's important to remember that COP26 wasn't the end point, but it's an important part of a process that carries on and on with ever increasing ambition and urgency until we fix this problem. And there was a great sense that Glasgow had sort of kick-started things again after a bit of a pause, and kicked off the sort of a relay race that we need to see continually accelerating action over the coming years, decades, to halve emissions by 2030, which is the ultimate goal.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, that's a more encouraging answer than I had expected. So it's great to start, but it's not, and we hear a lot of doom and gloom about climate change. I want to get into the substance of your particular focus. You mentioned Indigenous peoples, and I know you've worked in the field and have made that as part of your study. But if we could sort of set the picture, I think we're all aware of a nature crisis. Every time we see an Attenborough film, it's about species becoming extinct, and we're very aware of that. We're aware of the climate change crisis. But the link between the two is not obvious, actually. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the two crises and how they intersect, because it's really the background to all of your work.
It is the background to all of my work. It was also a really, really dominant theme at COP26, was broad recognition. No one was disputing the deep interrelationship and interlinkages between addressing climate change and addressing biodiversity loss. A lot of language around that these were two sides of the same coin, that we can't meet one challenge without also addressing the other. So if we think about what's happening on our lands across the world, I mean, the second biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, and all the rest of them, comes from land use change through industrial agriculture. And that is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss on lands. So in theory, if we look after our carbon stores, if we look after our lands, we protect and restore and more sustainably manage our working lands and our forests and our ecosystems, and we can go into some more detail about this, we can, and lock up the carbon within them, we can, at least in theory, both slow warming whilst also protecting biodiversity loss. So I think that's what's, so similar drivers, and therefore shared solutions in many cases. So these are really, really important to sort of see on a level playing field. And there's obviously an enormous amount of emphasis on the very urgent need to address climate change. But what we've seen over the last few COPs, over the last few years, is also sort of putting the spotlight on the twin challenge. And actually bigger than that is the recognition that all these massive challenges we face, whether poverty, food insecurity, water insecurity, disaster risk reduction, all these different things, inequality, they actually all share common drivers and common solutions. And we won't find a solution for any of these individually. We need these sort of holistic, joined up solutions. And there's been a real shift in the narrative that's been very welcome and is underpinned by scientific evidence.
So, and I noticed the emphasis on this even in the coverage of COP. You mentioned solutions, and obviously nature-based solutions, and the initiative is your field. Could you kind of give us some examples of what those solutions are? So what is a nature-based solution to a part of climate change?
Yeah, thank you. There is still quite a lot of confusion about this, and a lot of my work in the last 2 years has been trying to really communicate what they are, what they're not, what works, what doesn't work, to avoid some of the pitfalls and problems around the term. But put very simply, nature-based solutions involve working with natural systems, working with natural ecosystems to address societal challenges, be it climate change, be it health, food security, those sorts of things. And they encompass a wide range of actions, and the sort of broad buckets of actions. So the protection of natural ecosystems, the incorporation of blue or green infrastructure into urban areas, the application of nature-based principles to agricultural systems, for example, agroforestry. So it's protecting, restoring, connecting natural ecosystems, sustainably managing working lands, and bringing green and blue infrastructure into our cities. And the concept of a nature-based solution is grounded in the understanding that healthy, resilient natural ecosystems are essentially our life support system. And that's not an exaggeration in any way. You know, healthy ecosystems provide us with food, genetic resources, clean water. They store carbon, they control floods, they stabilize shorelines, they provide us with our medicines, genetic resources, and so forth. And basically human development has proceeded as if none of that has any value at all. And it's now payback time. We need to repay our debt to nature by investing it back in the natural world so that it can then help us both, you know, slow things like climate change, whilst also protecting us from the impacts of climate change that are already locked into the system. So a really nice example of that in the UK would be, say, managed realignment along our coastlines to move the seawall back, allow salt marshes to regenerate. This reduces the, you know, the impacts of sea level rise and of storm surges, reduces the incidence of flooding along the coast, whilst also supporting biodiversity, whilst also increasing the absorption of carbon from the atmosphere. And that then cleaning the water as it comes run off through the agricultural lands, which improves the health of the marine ecosystem, which then enables other ecosystems like seagrass meadows. So I'm sort of focusing in on UK examples, but there are obviously other amazing and important examples, such as mangrove restoration. Mangroves are a big carbon powerhouse, 40 times more efficient at absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. They also protect coastlines, infrastructure, property during storm surges from sea level rise, whilst also sustaining fishery nursery grounds for economically important fisheries. So sort of a nature-based solution is about sort of like, you know, working with nature in a holistic way, not just because it provides carbon benefits or just because it supports food security, but because if properly implemented, it can support all those things. So that's sort of what a nature-based solution is.
Particularly interesting because your background is in evolutionary biology. And I'm just wondering how you distinguish between what's a natural evolution of our biodiversity. So things presumably should become extinct at some point, you know, some things, and the landscape is bound to change. How do you, what's the dividing line between what is normal and natural in evolution and what is a climate change related thing that you want to resist or reshape?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct to point out that extinction is a necessary and a fundamental part of the evolutionary process. But what we're finding is that the rate of extinction and the rate of change is so fast that it outpaces the capacity of, you know, evolutionary processes to provide adaptation to those changes. So it's incredibly fast, the changes that we're seeing, the losses, the rate of species loss. And that rate of species loss is, you know, there's not enough time for new species that are adapted to the new conditions. And so we have to support biodiversity so that it can adapt. So we have to make space for nature, and we have to support, when we're implementing these nature-based solutions, we have to ensure that they are underpinned by biodiversity and that they provide local biodiversity benefits, not because biodiversity is just a nice to have, or, you know, something that we might try and protect if we have resources to do so, but because biodiversity underpins the flow of all the things that we value from nature. You know, that diversity in our ecosystems is that which brings resilience. You know, in a very volatile market, you want a diverse investment portfolio, don't you? It's the same in a rapidly changing world. You're not sure what's coming, you know, that a lot of change is coming. And if you've got a lot of species in an ecosystem, then at least a subset of those species will continue being able to do what species need to do to keep the ecosystem healthy and functioning. So we can't overlook biodiversity, and some of the misuse and abuse of the term nature-based solutions and the conflation of a nature-based solution with commercial forestry, for example, where you might have a monoculture plantation. Those aren't going to be resilient. They're going to probably go up in smoke or have, you know, severe dieback through a new disease that comes through because they're not sufficiently biodiverse. So actually my sort of training as an evolutionary biologist and somebody that's spent a lot of time thinking about what biodiversity is, why it's important, this has, you know, hugely important implications for understanding, you know, in making sure that investments in nature are you know, support biodiversity and support resilience.
Thanks very much. I'm going to stop there because I know Anthony Cantwell's posted to say he's lost sound. Is everybody else hearing this okay? In that case, I'm afraid it's the problem at your end, Anthony, and this will be live streamed, or well, not live streamed, but streamed later, so that you'll be able to pick it up. Apologies. Now, you mentioned Indigenous communities and their natural understanding of biodiversity. And reading up about this before tonight and your work, it's really fascinating because there's a lot of romanticism about Indigenous communities and a lot of, frankly, I think rather abusive kind of co-option of their plight. But actually, as your work shows, they have some extraordinary wisdom. I mean, could you say a little bit more about Indigenous communities and your work on that?
I think, you know, the evidence is very clear that the lowest rates of forest loss and the highest levels of carbon sequestration and protection occur within Indigenous lands across the world. So there's been some great work showing that, you know, in those Indigenous territories in Amazonia, we have the lowest levels of forest loss and the highest sort of implementation, as it were, of nature-based solutions. And I think, you know, human beings have been working with nature in a variable climate, you know, to deal with the impacts of, you know, climatic variability for millennia. And often Indigenous peoples and local communities have, you know, great working and, you know, great understanding of how to work with nature. And we have an enormous amount to learn from them. But I think, you know, there's a lot of, I mean, Indigenous peoples is a sort of like this sort of term that encapsulates a lot of variability. And obviously, depending on what part of the world you're talking about, Indigenous peoples and local communities will have more or less understanding of how to work with their ecosystems. But I think the important point is, unless you work with local communities, whether they're Indigenous peoples or farmers or local landowners or whoever they are, you know, your intervention is not going to be successful. It has to be very much led from the bottom up and incentivized from the bottom up. And something like a nature-based solution is very much a place-based partnership between people and nature. You know, so we might not talk about the value of Indigenous knowledge in the context of the UK. We might talk about it in the context of the Andes and the Amazon. But the point is that local knowledge is important. If we ignore it, not only is it ethically, you know, it's a terrible thing to do ethically, but it also means that those interventions won't be sustainable on the long term. Over the long term, they've got to work. And they've got to provide those local benefits. Otherwise, they won't work. They won't work over the long term. And
how in practice is that done, Natalie? I mean, you mentioned they were represented. Some of the Indigenous communities represented in COP26. How is that knowledge being captured and used?
So, you know, the best projects, sort of the best practice nature-based solutions projects, work with, local communities. So explore their understanding and learn from and share that knowledge, you know, among different communities. So it's about developing, bringing together scientific knowledge with local knowledge. There's a lot of learning by doing as well. In a rapidly warming world, it's not always obvious what we need to do in the local ecosystem. You know, it might be that different species are needed. We might be able to learn from sort of Indigenous knowledge or indeed science that's been conducted in other parts of the world and apply it to new areas of the world. So it's about creating opportunities for sharing knowledge. So some of the work that we do is showcasing best practice from around the world and connecting communities across, say that communities that are working in mangrove forests in Bangladesh with those that are working in mangrove forests in Colombia, for example, or people working in montane areas in India, in the Himalayas, with those working in the Andes, so that they can learn from one another. And there's a lot of south-north learning. The global south have having to deal with the impacts of climate change much sooner than we've had to, because they've been really feeling the brunt of the effects, and they are learning. Like communities in Bangladesh where I work are innovating all the time because they have to. And are innovating all sorts of really interesting ways of working with nature to help them deal with increased flooding or increased drought or whatever it might be. And we have a lot to learn from them in this part of the world.
Well, that's really interesting. What kind of things are they doing that we could point to?
Well, I think, ways of sustainably managing their working lands and bringing, getting agroforestry to work. So growing crops among trees and trees among crops is one thing. And in Bangladesh, I'm not sure we're quite ready for this, but we may well be. They've innovated a brilliant form of floating agriculture. So this has been developed in areas that were dependent on rice cultivation, where flooding is becoming the norm. And most of the year there's too much flooding and too much rainfall to grow rice anymore. But they've got converting an invasive species into sort of big linear rotting beds of vegetation and planting fruit trees and vegetables within it. These can be tended by boats. There's no application as far as we know, of fertilizers or other chemicals. Obviously, the floating beds go up and down with the water level, and it provides year-round nutrition and year-round income and food security in a way that isn't possible, in the absence of such a thing, given that the option of growing rice is no longer possible in many of those regions. So that's a really interesting example. And that's just spreading out, even without any sort of external, sort of scaling out, even without the external inputs of finance for it. It's becoming such a, a popular practice. And although it's sort of contained within Bangladesh at the moment, it's likely to spread across, much of Southeast Asia, where similar challenges are being faced.
It's a great example. I mean, I guess the factory farming, industrial farming lobby would say, well, the problem is it can't be scaled. But are you confident these solutions can be scaled up?
I think it's important to say and be very clear that nature-based solutions are not an alternative to technological solutions or societal solutions. We need all sorts of different solutions, and different things work in different places. And nature can provide, adaptation benefits, food security benefits in certain places at certain times. And clearly, some parts of the earth we're going to have to intensify agriculture, and other parts of earth we're going to have to do a combination of things. We're going to have working lands where some areas are protected, some areas are there's intensive agriculture, and others there's more nature-based agricultural practices such as agroforestry. And we have to really be quite experimental in how we roll out these things. And some of the work I'm involved in is developing scenarios of how, for example, in the UK, we might scale up nature-based solutions in the UK, given change in climate, change in trade, change in diet, and all these different things, moving parts that influence the efficacy of any particular approach. But we're certainly not advocating completely rewilding areas. Mostly, people, there are people everywhere, and they need feeding, and there are multiple conflicts around land use. And so the question is what combination of approaches can we take within this landscape at this time, given the change we know is likely to be on the horizon?
Well, final question from me then, which follows on from that. I'm going to hand over to the screen. You mentioned 4 or 5 changes there. One of them presumably means changing the way we live. So we're going to have to change our behaviour to some extent. And one of the most popular questions about climate change is, what can we do ourselves to change? Have you any thoughts on how human behaviour is going to have to change, say, in this country, and what we personally can do?
Well, we do need systemic change. How we measure economic progress, and a movement away from GDP is absolutely essential. A movement towards a biocircular economy and more regenerative agriculture, regenerative economy is incredibly important. As individuals, we must consume less, we have to fly less, and we have to make careful choices about our diet. And there is now good evidence that to free up land for nature so that nature can help us address the climate challenge and other challenges, we also have to shift towards a more plant-based diet. So I think these are critical things. But one of the wonderful things about nature-based solutions is that actually one's involvement in nature-based solutions. So we recently made some films about nature-based solutions in action around the UK, and one of them was about bringing nature into cities. And there's all sorts of benefits of bringing nature into cities in terms of, dealing with heat wave, reducing the impacts of heat waves, and reducing the impacts of flooding. But some of the most important benefits is the reconnection of human beings with nature, therapeutic benefits, mental health benefits, and so forth. And a lot of that was actually realised during COVID. And so there's been a sort of huge movement towards, bringing nature into cities, but bringing nature into cities in a way that then just doesn't lead to a cascade of gentrification, but increases equality rather than increasing inequality in cities. So, and there are lots of programs working with schools, bringing school children into this, bringing tree planting and other sorts of ecosystem restoration. There are all sorts of opportunities, amazing things going on across the UK and in fact across the world, wildlife trusts, local county council groups, all sorts of things which are bringing people, children, all different age groups together at weekends to sort of be part of this sort of landscape restoration movement that is being kickstarted over the last year or two.
Thanks, and I strongly recommend your films. I thought they were great and really helpful. By chance, I was with the Singaporean delegation today, who were very interested in bringing it into the city, and have done some great work actually on that.
Yeah,
so it's a fascinating area. Look, I'm going to stop talking and asking questions because I know a lot of people would like to come in. Can I suggest that you either raise your hand Zoom style with the Zoom button, or put something in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. But ideally, if you want to ask your own question, that would be great. So please either put your real hand up or your Zoom hand up, and I'll have a look at the screen and see if I can see who's. So I can see Brian Riddleston's in there first. So Brian, would you like to unmute and fire away?
Hello. I was involved with JNCC, which you all know, but many others won't, is the umbrella organisation for ecological advice from the various countries within in the UK. Natural England, I was from Wales, but SNH in Scotland, and the Civil Service in Ireland. And we were, and presumably still are, the government's advisor on ecology. Now, I was fortunate enough, biology is not my background, but I was fortunate enough to chair the first committee that JNCC set up on climate change in the early 2000s. One of the concerns I've always had is whether, as the government's formal advisors, I'm always concerned as to whether they are getting conflicting or consistent information, both from JNCC and also the various research organisations involved. So I'd just like to ask, how much are the various organisations involved, and are there really consistent messages to DEFRA, or are we struggling with conflicting messages to DEFRA?
I've certainly seen definitely in the area that I work, which is on as we know, on nature-based solutions, definite growing consensus and alignment of, as the science has improved. And you know, there are lots of scientists aren't just in universities. Obviously, many of those organisations you mentioned also have a core science team, and so we're working in these sort of partnerships across the different sectors more and more to co-create the science, but also then to create the policy briefs and to ensure alignment. And certainly, I feel, especially over the last couple of years, a real sort of sense of a coming together and a clarification over key messages about what we need to do and when. And increasingly on the sort of the bigger picture stuff around emissions and loss and damage and all these other things, which we might get into if people are interested, other sort of the bigger picture things that emerged from COP26, also a growing consensus. This is less conflicted in the scientific space than things used to be or perceived as being. So,
thank you very much, Brian. Before I come to Freddie Shuffrey up there on screen, there's a chat question from Alexandra Davey. How do you feel, Nathalie, about the global rush to reforest areas, including those that would not naturally be forested, so grasslands, savannas? And what's your reaction to that? And the reforestation was a kind of promise of COP26.
Yeah, so there was the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, which actually that declaration was around 141 countries have committed to reversing and halting deforestation by 2030. And that's halting deforestation, which is absolutely the thing we first need to do before we start talking about reforestation. And we need to not just be talking about forests and trees, we need to be talking about peatlands and kelp forests and coral reefs and mangroves and all the other ecosystems that we know are critically important. And I am all for reforestation, so putting the right species back in the right places. As you quite rightly pointed out, it's really problematic to put trees where trees don't naturally exist, and there are all sorts of problems, all sorts of issues around land grabs and the replacement of really, really valuable biodiverse carbon-rich ecosystems with monoculture tree plantations, all in the name of climate change, when actually the contribution of climate change is negligible, or actually is making it worse, and actually the impacts on biodiversity are very, very damaging. So we've been doing, this is a massive area because it all kind of interfaces with the carbon markets and the whole issue around carbon offsetting. It's critically important, if we're going to be investing in trees, that we make sure they're where they should be, and that they are, that they are not compromising, some of the food security needs of the most vulnerable people as well. So there's complexities there, and the conflation of tree planting and commercial plantations with a climate solution is hugely problematic. So good to have highlighted that. And I do a lot of work on this particular question.
Thanks very much. So I think we'll come back to offsetting because it's a really topical issue. Freddie Sheffer, you've had your hand up, your Zoom hand up for a while, but over to you.
Thanks, thanks, and thanks, Professor Seddon, for your remarks so far. I have to confess a kind of professional interest in this. I actually work in DEFRA, in our International Environment Negotiations Division, heading up our G7 team, where for the UK's presidency this year, we kind of deliberately convened a joint climate environment track, and so we're kind of very alive to drawing the necessary links between the climate and biodiversity crises. And I was actually involved down in London rather than Glasgow in reviewing some of the nature cover text, particularly on NBS. And I think my question is, obviously this was the most kind of nature positive COP we'd ever seen so far, with more nature text in the covering text than at Paris or previous COPs, and particularly around the pledges on forests, as you mentioned, the Glasgow Declaration and the forest finance. And looking ahead, I guess, to Kunming next year and CBD COP15 Part 2, how do we build on this and really make sure that we can kind of integrate this, these decisions as the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is drawn up and negotiated and agreed, and really make sure that nature-based solutions, kind of nature itself, features really prominently within that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great question. Obviously, it was a bit of a roller coaster ride around nature in the last, well, it's always a roller coaster. The last 3 days of any COP is always a roller coaster ride, because you get one version of the sort of the full bells and whistles idealized decision text on the Wednesday. Sometimes it's even later than that, and then by the Friday, by the Saturday, there's been words removed, things watered down, other things added, you know, and it's obviously this hugely complicated process of negotiations with all these different countries with their diverse interests. And so we did have on the Wednesday of week 2, I know, a fantastic text around nature and nature-based solutions, with the term nature-based solutions. Sounds like you're involved in it. Nature-based solutions in several places, and we sort of thought, well, yeah, are any of the by the time we got to Saturday, we'd lost the term nature-based solutions, but we had nature-based solutions more or less in all but name. So that acknowledgement of the, as you say, the interlinkages between biodiversity loss and climate change, the recognition that the protection and restoration of nature was critical to meeting both adaptation and mitigation. And I was very pleased to see the emphasis there on adaptation first, because that's the most important contribution that nature has, I believe, in terms of addressing the climate challenge. Mitigation also important, but complex. And also the decision text reflected the importance of Indigenous knowledge and land rights and so forth. So it was interesting to see that go. And I think given everything, we were fighting for a while there, but given everything else that was going on, you sort of get to a point, don't you, Freddie, where you just go, okay, it's now all about coal and ambition ratchets and timeframes and Article 6. So we'll just leave things there. But I think it's important to get the term nature-based solutions into the text by Egypt. It would have been nice to have had it in COP26, because it would have made it more likely that it then would have been in the decision text of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So I realise we're descending into jargon now, aren't we? So there's the COP26 was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but obviously we have the Convention of Biological Diversity in China, which is fascinating that China is hosting it with all sorts of implications, but they are hosting that meeting in Kunming later towards the middle of next year. And ideally, we want greater alignment between these Rio conventions, and including nature-based solutions in there, clearly defined, would be helpful. There was quite a lot of pushback against the term, particularly by certain vulnerable countries, and by women's groups and Indigenous groups, and made us realise that we have a lot more work to do this year, really on the integrity piece, on really trying to communicate to the right people what good nature-based solutions are, that they're not to be used in greenwashing. And I feel that we have a global standard for nature-based solutions. We have science-based, evidence-based guidelines to guide investments towards the most robust nature-based solutions. But despite that, there are concerns about greenwashing. And I think it's a little bit frustrating, because the people are angry and worried about greenwashing and violation of land rights and anything that seems to be commodifying nature, and there's pushback from countries about that. But if we get nature-based solutions in the decision text, that will then give parties the oversight to ensure that nature-based solutions are not used in greenwashing and only involve, high integrity projects. So I think it's worth worth doing that. So in terms of what we need to do, we've got a lot of work to do. We've got to talk to the dissenters. We've got to work with countries like Bolivia and the women's groups, and we've got to work with those aspects of the environmental movement that are really complaining about the term nature-based solutions when really they should just be complaining about the process of greenwashing.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, and thanks, Freddie. I'm delighted to hear you're working on this with DEFRA. That's great. Couple of questions coming up on rewilding, which I'll come back to, but I want to go to John Healy. Before I do, somebody's asked, William Much, what is greenwashing? Could you give a 60-second what's greenwashing?
So this is sort of any sort of pledges or actions for improved environmental activities, so green activities, and we're talking about investing in nature-based solutions that distracts from or delays from the actual systemic change that we need. So you can't invest in nature-based solutions instead of decarbonising the economy. You've got to do everything as a business, as a nation, as a government. You've got to do everything you possibly can to scale back the use of fossil fuels. And then you also need to invest in nature. You can't invest in nature or plant trees and continue to emit, because if you don't scale back fossil fuels, or if we don't eliminate the use of fossil fuels, then the warming that will result will undermine the capacity of nature to provide any solutions at all. And so people are worried about businesses and governments saying, yeah, we're going to invest all this stuff in nature, excuse me. They say they're going to invest all this stuff in nature and then not do anything about decarbonisation. And that's what greenwashing is. And there are concerns that this is happening, and there is evidence that this is happening, and we need to address that. Sorry about the call.
No, thank you very much, Nathalie. John, over to you, John Healy.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I better sort of declare my interest as the Professor of Forest Sciences at Bangor University. So I guess I have a sort of skin in the game with this, but I want to pick up the points you made, Nathalie, about the integration of nature-based solutions with other approaches to, for instance, food production. So thinking, and also clearly we'd agree we have a huge challenge of feeding as well as providing fibre and biomass needs of an ever-growing population. So I want to ask about the sort of what the scaling issues related to the concept of nature-based solutions. So I don't know if necessarily the nature-based solutions part of our approach necessarily has to mean a very integrated land sharing approach, or whether at the landscape scale we can still imagine a mixed portfolio of sustainable intensified agriculture and wood production, as well as some mixed land uses, but all at the larger scale. Does nature-based solutions apply to that larger scale mosaic, or is the concept best confined to a highly integrated land sharing model?
I think the answer is an annoying one, and it very much depends, doesn't it? And I think some parts of the world, some landscapes with their specific sorts of geomorphologies and ecosystems are more suitable for large scale rewilding or reforestation. Others are much more suitable for a more mosaic approach. And others again are going to be more suitable for doing a more a land sparing approach versus a land sharing approach. I think it very, very much depends, which is why we need to do quite a lot of sort of regional level, local level analyses and scenario modeling to sort of figure out what the possible combination of approaches might be for that area. Clearly we need forestry, we need wood products, and we need more wood products for more building materials that emit less and to lock down carbon. So there's a really important role that forestry can play if it's done in a certain way. And the problem has been, and that I alluded to, is when it's seen as the climate solution rather than emissions reductions, or instead of restoring our peatlands, or if it replaces peatlands and things.
I think John's question sort of picks up two on the chat too, one from Professor Lucy Huberman and one from Prashant Vase, really saying that the spectrum between climate smart agriculture through to rewilding, and there are quite a number of questions about rewilding and what's going on in Scotland and Cumbria and various other places. Anything more you want to say on rewilding, UK style?
So rewilding means different things to different people. I mean, some people think this means we just want to reintroduce wolves everywhere into the Highlands. And clearly, that might work in some areas within Europe, but many areas it won't work. But I think it's all about what's appropriate given the the socioeconomic and biological context of a particular area. And I think actually some of the projects I've been involved with I am involved with in Scotland, and one of the films we made on the Highlands isn't really about rewilding in that sense. It's not about turning a landscape back to nature alone. It's about people and nature in the same landscape. It's about people working with nature as part of nature, not separate from nature. And you know, there are areas where, yes, you know, supporting the ecosystem so it can regenerate, in the case of Scotland, back to that sort of Atlantic coast mature pine forests, like temperate rainforest, which some parts could be Caledonian forest, but other areas are going to be, you know, a combination of you know, different sorts of agriculture and timber production for sustainable housing. And it's not about one sort of silver bullet or one description of it. I mean, some people worry that they have concerns about that. I mean, we are going to need to get better at living with wild nature, I think, and there will be so many benefits of doing that. Having a more balanced ecosystem that has, you know, different sorts of predators in it is a good thing long term, but obviously it's very, very, very place-based, and it very much depends on what the baseline is, what the current land uses are. And the best projects are those that are being rolled out after long consultation processes with all the local farmers and the local communities and so forth, to sort of, you know, create a sort of a range of scenarios that sort of fits that landscape.
Thank you very much. A couple more questions. One from Colin Drummond, interesting question about, can you price your solutions? Is it in the way, can you price the ecosystems you're creating in the way, or is it simply too complicated, and is it really about carbon pricing? Is it the same question? Or how do you judge what's going to have value?
I think it's really important to get away from a carbon focus in terms of valuing ecosystems, because if you just focus on carbon, you get some fairly, you know, perverse outcomes. You might end up with a monoculture plantation in an area where actually there were many benefits of an alternative approach. And I think unless you, as I said to you before, unless you're also factoring in biodiversity as with the carbon, you won't even get the carbon benefits over the long term, because that measure won't be resilient. There's a lot of work to improve the metrics and to channel finance into the projects that have those sort of long-term benefits around. And it's not just about biodiversity, it's also about equity. So this is where some really interesting research is taking place, and a lot of that is actually taking place in Oxford, about how we bring together sort of granular technology-enabled information about the carbon and the biodiversity benefits with the sort of messier but you know, arguably just as important information about land rights and power and local dynamics, and create tools that will enable those that are making decisions about the landscapes to make the best choices, but and to enable finance to benefit, you know, to pay for ecosystem services more broadly, not just the carbon, but all the other things. And again, there was some great, all sorts of things going on at COP26 in this space about how, you know, natural capital mapping, so how we map our natural assets, thinking about water, thinking about food, thinking about biodiversity, thinking about equity, and all these things, and how we bring this together to say, well, okay, this is the current value of the landscape, and this is what it could be, and these are the benefits that it could bring, and these are the mechanisms by which we might be able to fund ecosystem stewardship, whether through environmental land management schemes, which has been piloted in the UK but will be taken to scale soon.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bunch a couple of questions together, actually. Tamsin Norman asking, you know, is there any advice you could give to get local communities engaged in nature-based solutions? And a slightly closer to home one from Andrea Connell about what should Wadham be doing as an institution to get Kunming and Paris aligned? Two different questions, but I mean, they're both about what we can do.
So the Wildlife Trust is an amazing organisation in the UK. You know, that they are doing nature-based solutions big time. You know, there's all sorts of projects that are going on: swamp restoration, peatland restoration, tree planting, hedge laying, all these different activities all over the place, which they are, you know, providing opportunities sort of every week, every weekend for you to get involved with them. You know, and if you go to the Wildlife Trust's website, there's all sorts of projects going on in all the different counties of the UK. They're all on this, they're all doing it. And actually one of the nice things about making the films was sort of really realizing like how sophisticated and brilliant a lot of approaches that are being taken are by local wildlife groups. And it's very, very important to support them in their efforts. So there's a lot going on. And then in the context of cities and urban areas, again, local county councils, local businesses, lots of organisations are doing this now because they recognise that this is an economically important thing to do. It's going to support jobs, support livelihoods, help us recover from the pandemic, whilst also drawing down and storing carbon and protecting us from the impacts of climate change. And I think as those impacts of climate change really ramp up in the UK, and the evident benefits of working with nature to reduce flood risk in our towns by reforesting our slopes, for example, as that becomes more obviously obvious that that's what we need to do, more and more people are going to get involved. The second question
was really on Wadham, and I can throw into that an extra question because we're nearly running out, but it's offsetting again, because I mean a lot of academic and student carbon is to do with flying. Can you give us your views? We are introducing offsetting here, but we're all conscious it's a kind of at best a medium-term solution. Any advice for us on offsetting?
I think you really need to ensure that those that are using your funding to offset their emissions are also doing everything they possibly can to reduce their emissions as soon as possible, that they have net zero plans in place, and those net zero plans are underpinned by robust actions to do what, and they're not using it in greenwashing. They're not using it to kick the can down the road. So some airline companies are better than others, some fuel suppliers are better than others in this regard, but there's a lot of regulation, government regulation coming on environmental and social and governance safeguards and regulation, ESG regulations, basically, that is going to require companies to transparently report on their impacts, not just on the climate, but also on people and the biosphere, and to provide evidence that they are doing everything they can to reduce those impacts, and where they can't reduce them entirely, to then offset the emissions that they can't deal with at the moment. And I think that's the context in which offsetting can work. There's this term called insetting, which is more about making sure that this is for supply chains. So in terms of companies that are commodity companies, because the production of commodities is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss and climate change. There's been big pledges, including at COP26, of companies to clean up those supply chains, to report on their impacts, and to offset their emissions within their supply chains. So they're increasing the value of their supply chains by investing in all sorts of different practices, including nature-based solutions within them. That's why it's called insetting rather than offsetting. And that seems to be more positive, because there's something very wrong about thinking I can do a load of damage over here by doing something vaguely okay over there. And then, the science is very clear that doesn't work. You can't really do that, but you can increase, the resilience and the value of your supply chain by reducing impacts and investing in nature-based solutions within those supply chains.
Which reminds me of a question I wanted to ask, but that is about the private sector. And I know you engage with it, and greenwashing, of course, is relevant. There are lots of people who would like you to greenwash them. But in general, on supply chain, they were very involved at COP26, private sector. What's your view about the big companies? There seem to be some interesting things happening.
Yeah, there are. There's some companies that are making pledges and then they've no idea how they're going to meet them, and that's not good. There are other companies that aren't making pledges but are doing a lot of work behind the scenes to ensure that when they do make their pledges, whether it's around net zero or nature positive or ideally both, that's underpinned by, a robust, verifiable, actionable plan of how they're going to do it across their supply chains. And there seem to be a shift in the corporate sector around nature positivity, people in that sector talking about biodiversity, talking about integrity, talking about the need to respect land rights and human rights. For some, that's just words that they know they need to say. For others, there's a genuine interest and keenness to engage with the conservation, science and the development sector to ensure that they actually can deliver on some of those high level pledges. And of course, the next year and beyond is to make sure that all that was promised at COP by both the private and the public sector is actioned. We need to see some significant progress on action and implementation by the time we get to Egypt. And I think there is more funding in place, but we need to make sure the funding gets to where it needs to get in the form it needs to be received in. That's really critical. You can't just throw a lot of money and technology at a problem and expect it to be solved. You need to create those mechanisms to ensure that the people and the communities and the ecosystems that need the most support are the ones that are getting it in the form that's relevant to them.
Thank you very much. We're really almost out of time, but there's one more question I should ask, because there's been a lively exchange on this on the chat, which is about global population. Was this raised as an issue at COP26? And are there too many people in the world? And if you could do that in 60 seconds.
The problem is consumerism. I mean, the global north produces, you know, tiny fraction of the global population produces 70% of the emissions. I forget the precise numbers because it shifts a little bit. But it is the level of consumerism in the rich world which is driving biodiversity loss and climate change. Of course, it would be great to have fewer people overall on the planet, and the education of women is very important in that regard. But actually, climate change is the result of overconsumption in the global north.
So this is Michael Guy's point, actually. There are not too many people, there are too many rich people.
Exactly,
Interesting.
Exactly. Which is why it's important that at COP26, we didn't really get time for me to say what I thought was actually significant and important about COP26. But one key thing is that there's a recognition of this issue of loss and damage, that the developed rich world needs to pay for the damage, the loss and damage being suffered by the most vulnerable communities. We are working this year to ensure that there is a facility for loss and damage. In other words, to ensure that all this finance for adaptation that's been pledged actually gets to those communities that need it. And the loss of that loss and damage facility from the decision text in the final moments of COP was disappointing, but I think we need to sort of behave as though it exists and make sure that it exists, because that's really important. Doubling of adaptation, of finance for adaptation was an important outcome as well. So there's general recognition that we do, those of us, the polluting nations that have caused this problem, really do need to support the vulnerable communities and help them deal with the impacts of climate change, whilst also massively scaling back our emissions. So some of the language around that has advanced considerably. We just now need to make sure that it's, you know, it actually results in actions and implementation on the ground.
So that was going to be my final question, which was 2022. There's not that long now before Egypt, the next meeting. Particularly in your area, Nathalie, what do you want to see happen in that year?
Yeah, it's funny you should say my area, because the most important thing we need to do is keep fossil fuels in the ground. So that is the overarching thing. So we need to ensure that all the major emitting countries produce significantly more ambitious climate pledges by Egypt. Because at the moment, you know, we're on target. If all the climate pledges were met that the countries currently haven't, we're on target for over 2 degrees warmer by the end of the century. In other words, we're nowhere near 1.5 degrees. I mean, the COP kept the 1.5 degree goal alive in the decision text, and that's really important. And a really important thing that happened at COP26 was a commitment by all nations to increase ambition over a 12 months rather than a 5-year period. So we have a much more ambitious ambition ratchet mechanism, as it were. So that really needs to happen. We can't get to Egypt in 12 months' time and not to have seen significant ramping up of ambition, because the big failure of COP26, and it wasn't just COP26, but you know, the build up to it, is that actually the level of ambition in countries' current pledges is nowhere near what's needed in order to avert dangerous climate warming. So that's really what needs to happen, and we need to sort of really ensure that finance is compliant with this agreement, that we don't lock in long-term damage to the biosphere through fossil fuel subsidies and by not phasing out coal production and so forth. So those things are of absolute, you know, absolutely overarching importance. And in the nature space, yes, there's I think work to ensure that nature is not being used in greenwashing, to improve standards and guidelines around what constitutes a high quality nature-based solution, work on vetting the investors to ensure that they're not, you know, they are doing everything they possibly can to scale down emissions and to eventually land, you know, nature-based solutions in the decision text. There's various milestones and various things along the way. So we do have our work cut out for us over the next 12 months to ensure that all the momentum and the good things that emerge from COP26 actually result in, you know, quite fundamental transformative change. And there's a chance of that, but we do need to work very hard, you know, in a cooperative way across all the world's countries, which is not an easy thing to do, especially in the current context of the current geopolitics.
Absolutely, and I think we're all in awe of the work you've done, actually, and I know it's not going to stop, and your extremely powerful advocacy is amazing to see, actually, in the films. I strongly recommend to anyone to watch. It's really great. Look, a number of thanks, because one of the great things, actually, looking across these screens is to realise, as well as those who've asked questions, how many people connected with Wadham are involved in climate change, including, I see Roger Snell there, Sunil Chalmers, former warden, and former Natural History Museum. So there is quite a Wadham community on climate change, which is great to see. And I want to say a few thanks before I hand over to Julie for a final word to alumni, but thank you for those who organised this, particularly Rachel and Salome for doing all the organisation of this, and to the excellent development team. Thank you particularly to all of you for taking the time to join tonight. It's been a really rich conversation. Thank you for asking really interesting questions. Above all, thank you, Nathalie, for taking the time. I know you've had an exhausting term and you're about to face into admission, so it's going to be an exhausting 2 weeks. We really appreciate it. We're really proud of what you're doing. So there is nothing more important at the moment. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Julie, I think, who is on the screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you very much, Nat, for showing how Wadham scholars are making an impact in the world and addressing probably the most important challenge of our time. And I think we're all very moved. But your ability to share both the coming togetherness and the sense of urgency has certainly given all of us a lot of opportunity for think harder and also think how we need to clearly change the way we live and the way we work and think. But we're incredibly grateful to all of you here for joining us. And as you probably know, we've had an incredible support from you all over the past year. We've had more than 2,500 alumni from all over the world joining us for various events throughout the year. And we plan to continue. I'm sitting here this night in the development office, which is the hub normally for us organizing lots and lots of events in person here in college, in London, up and down the country and around the world. I was hoping to share a message tonight of all the exciting in-person events coming up. Of course, since over the last couple of days, that has changed. We will be sharing with you. We are hoping that, for example, events in North America might go ahead in March, where Oxford traditionally is rallying alumni for reunions. The university has plans for reunions in Berlin in February, and we are very much hoping to get back on track with Gordy's here in college, both in the spring and in the summer. And very importantly, of course, to those of you who've already had a chance to visit, we have 2 beautiful new buildings in the back quad. We'd love to show them to you. We can offer you a socially distanced tour if you're able to visit. But very importantly, we do hope next year that we can celebrate and thank all those of you who've helped us and continue to help us on all fronts. So do stay safe and take care, and we'll be in touch over the coming weeks with also the programming for the new year. We are planning a new online event in February, for example, on global cities, poverty and psychoanalysis with Professor Anki Mukherjee in English and world literature. And there are a number of other things lined up as well. So you'll hear from us, but very importantly, take care. And thank you so much for joining us and for sharing in such a meaningful way. So take care and have a peaceful night, everyone.